Welcome to my video on Associated Press style rules for numbers. I know this will be very exciting. Actually, it kind of is. These aren't really too difficult. Like with most things with AP style, there's a general rule that applies to most situations, and then there's some specific rules that apply in certain situations. So we're going to look at those. In this lesson, we're going to cover several entries in the AP style book. They're listed there on the screen. So you can take a look at those individually if you'd like, but for now we're going to start with the general rule for numbers. Okay? The general rule is this: if the number is 0 through 9, you use words. Okay? And anything that is 10 and above, you use numerals. Okay? Use numerals. Okay, so 0, 1, 7, 9, 9. There we go. Anything above 10, think of other numbers, 99, 378. Okay, those are all numerals. Once we get into the thousands, once we go to the fourth digit and beyond, then we need to start using a comma with those. 1,000, 3,000, 350,000, like that. Okay, pretty simple. Gets a little more complicated once we move beyond 1 million though. So once we get into the numbers that are 7 digits or more, you use a combination of figures and words. So starting with 1 million, we write the numeral 1 and million, or 10 million, or 5 billion, or 17 trillion. Okay? What happens if the number that you need to use is not exactly a number of millions or a number of billions? Well, then you use numerals and decimals. So 1.2 million, 37.5 billion, and so on. You can go to 2 decimal places, but don't go to 3. So in other words, don't write 12.743 million. Round off to the nearest 2 decimal points, right? So this one we're going to say is bad. Don't do that. Right. So that's the rule for millions and billions. Okay, those are pretty straightforward. Now you know all the basic general rules that apply when there aren't any specific guidelines for a certain use. Okay, so those will apply for most numbers. Now what we're going to look at are some specific situations where you might do something different. Okay. The first one that we'll take a look at is for ages. Ages. That has its own entry in the style book, and this is pretty simple. If you're talking about the age of a person or a thing, always write it as a numeral. So obviously if someone is 17 years old, that would be written as numerals no matter what, because it's higher than 10. But even if we're talking about someone who's 6 years old, we write that as a numeral. Also, you can position ages with a person's name, and if it's clear to the reader that you're talking about an age, then that's all that needs to happen. So if you say Megan Smith, 6, won the beauty contest, okay, then it's clear to everybody who speaks the English language that you are meaning to say that Megan Smith is 6 years old. So we write that as a numeral in any way that it's used. This applies to animals, it applies to inanimate objects. The book is 9 years old. That is actually a change from an older style book. If your style books are more than a few years old, they may say something different about that. They may say something about it only applying to ages of people, but that's not the way it is anymore. If it refers to the age of something, always a numeral. Okay. Going forward with age, it applies to months as well. So if we say a 6-month-old child, that would sort of be redundant, actually. A 6-month-old girl, obviously you can't be a 6-month-old adult. Makes sense? Okay, always use numerals for ages. Second group of exceptions that we're going to look at, or not really a group, the second rule that's kind of an exception is percent. Couple things on percent. Do not use the percent symbol. So don't write 5%, right? We always spell out the word percent in AP style, unless it's in a chart or a table or something where it needs to be a symbol so that things line up in the chart. But always use numerals with percent. So 5%, 2%, 15%. Those are always written as numerals and rather than words when using percent. Okay, pretty easy. Let's take a look at ratios. There's also a stylebook entry for ratios. So in ratios, you would say we're talking about comparing two numbers. So you might say he was defeated by a 2-to-1 margin. These are often used in elections. The measure was voted down 2-to-1. You'll notice that in this instance there is a hyphen substituting for the word to. That's the case when the ratio modifies a word, a noun, like the word margin. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of this rule, but that's the way it's written up in the style book. Okay. All right, so key thing there is, though, if you're talking about ratios, use numbers. Number 5, look up the entry for dimensions. If you were talking about just about any sort of dimension of length, width, height, anything like that, distance, you always use numerals. So 5 miles, 6 inches, etc., etc. Notice too that I'm spelling out the units. Okay, don't abbreviate the units in these. One of the handful of exceptions I can think of in the style book where you do abbreviate the units is in miles per hour and miles per gallon. So they would write in AP the speed limit is 65, miles per hour, or my car gets 30 miles per gallon. Okay, but always use numerals when you're dealing with dimensions, length, width, distance, etc. Dollar amounts. There's an entry for dollars, there's an entry for cents. As with these other things we've been talking about, you always use numerals when dealing with dollar amounts, and you do use a dollar sign, so you would say $7. If it's some amount of dollars and cents, you use the dollar amount, oops, sorry about that, $7.50, use the decimal point, but only use the decimal point when there is not a, in other words, don't do this. Okay, if it's on an even amount of money, just the dollar. If you need to say that there's some cents involved, go ahead and use the decimal point with the cents. If you need to write some amount that's less than $1, you don't actually use the cent symbol. In fact, it's hard to find on computer keyboards these days. So spell out the word cents afterwards, 50 cents, just like that. If for some reason you need to write a dollar amount that's less than $1 in this form, you can do that, but using 50 and then the word cents will be much clearer to the reader. Okay, just a couple more of these. Times, as you might have guessed, always when talking about times, use figures. So if you mean 3 p.m., and we talked about this, or rather we will talk about this in another video, that times are always written in a specific way, 3 p.m. If it's not exactly on the hour, 3:30 p.m. Here's a good AP style tip that'll probably show up on quizzes and tests about copy editing all the time. Never use noon and never use 12 a.m. and 12 p.m. Always say noon or midnight. They are considered less confusing. So the words noon and midnight, don't use 12 a.m. or 12 p.m. And finally, the one that really bugs people is AP, like other style guides, has held hard and fast to the rule that you should not use a numeral to begin a sentence. So any of the rules that we've talked about, throw them out the window if the sentence begins with a number. So if you need to say that 37 students attended the game, your sentence would begin 37 students attended the game, which is probably a great reason to rephrase that sentence so that it does not begin with a number, so that you don't have to do this. Again, I don't quite understand the reason for the rule, but that's the way it is in the style book, and so that's what we're going to go with for our video. Okay, those are all the rules that I can think of that relate to numbers, but look up those specific entries for details on any of those.